On September 10th, the morning of my 7th birthday, I came downstairs to the kitchen where my mother was washing the dishes and my father was reading the paper. And I sort of presented myself to them in the doorway. And they said, "Hey, happy birthday." And I said, "I'm 7. And my father smiled and said, "Well, you know what that means, don't you?" And I said, "Yeah, that I'm going to have a party and a cake and get a lot of presents?" And my dad said, "Well, yes. But more importantly, being 7 means that you've reached the age of reason, and you're now capable of committing any and all sins against God and man." Now, I was happy to see that the Old Testament starts out with 2 conflicting stories about the origin of the universe. One where Adam and Eve are created at the exact same moment, and then a second creation story right away in chapter 2 where Adam is created first and then Eve is created out of his rib after he gets lonely. And I thought, oh, wow. For all those people who believe in the inerrancy of the Bible or that every single word of the Bible is true, I mean, they can't even have read the first 2 chapters of the Bible. I remember that Sister Charitina told us in 8th grade that Genesis was simply a poem on creation. We were not to take it literally. I shared this with the Bible study class, and Father Tom, this Irish priest who was leading the class, said, "That's exactly right, Julia, a poem on creation." Yes, nicely said, yes. But then we got to stories like Noah and the ark. And it was kind of funny. I don't really remember when I was studying this as a kid, Sister Mary Kevin highlighting the fact that Noah becomes an alcoholic after the flood and spends most of his time passed out and naked to the point where his sons have to go back up into a room with a blanket just to go cover him up because, geez, Dad. I realized I had always had the Bible served up to me piecemeal and in sections, and it had been edited, severely edited. It was quite different reading it as an adult. As an adult, you could begin to see the whole puzzle. As an adult, it was disturbing. For example, when I read about the flood as a kid, I didn't think about the fact that God killed everyone because he was angry. He just drowned them all because he thought they were all bad, which you have to assume included a lot of kids and unborn fetuses, which I guess was okay with God. But then I was relieved to read that God actually comes to Noah afterwards, and he says, "You know, the whole flood thing, it might have been a big mistake." And he promises he'll never do it again. And that was another surprise. God has regrets. Then we got to stories like Sodom and Gomorrah. All I remembered about that story is that they were these 2 sinful cities like Las Vegas and Reno or something. And God got mad and wiped them out. And Lot's wife looked back when she was told not to, and she got turned into a pillar of salt. But the nuns in my grade school didn't explain to us what happens right before they flee. Right before they flee, Lot is visited by these 2 angels who are masquerading as 2 men, and they come and stay overnight at his house, and this mob forms outside, and they yell, "Send out those 2 angel-like men to us so we can have sex with them." And Lot yells, "No!" which I think is a basic rule of hospitality. Don't give up your guests to be raped by the angry mob outside. But then what does he say next? He says, "Why don't you take my daughters and rape and do what you will with them? They're virgins." Okay, so Lot is evil, right? How is it that the story we know about him is about his wife getting turned into a pillar of salt? Maybe that was her only way out. Maybe being a big pillar of salt is preferable to being married to Lot. Anyway, after Lot and his 2 traumatized daughters flee Sodom and Gomorrah, they all go to a cave in the mountains and hide out. And during the night, Lot's 2 daughters get Lot drunk and then rape him. Did they do this in revenge of what their father did to them? No, the Bible says it's because there aren't any other men around. Even though the Bible also says that they're not that far from a city named Zoar, so I guess no men around for maybe a few miles? And wait a minute, so Lot's 2 daughters just had to drug and rape somebody, and then I guess if you're their dad and you're the only one. Okay. I knew the Bible had nutty stories. I mean, I knew there were nutty stories, but I don't know, I guess I thought they'd be wedged in amongst an ocean of inspiration and history. But instead, the stories just got darker and even more convoluted. This Old Testament God makes the grisliest tests of people's loyalty, like when he asks Abraham to murder his son Isaac. As a kid, we were taught to admire it. I caught my breath reading it. We were taught to admire it? What kind of sadistic test of loyalty is that, to ask someone to kill his or her own child? And isn't the proper answer, no? I will not kill my child or any child, even if it means eternal punishment in hell? At the next Bible study class, Father Tom reminded us that Isaac represents what matters to Abraham most, and that's what God asks us to give up for him. I said, but protecting and loving and caring for the welfare of your child is such a deep, ethical, loving instinct and act. So what if what matters to you most is your own loving behavior? Should we be willing to give up our ethics for God? And he said, no, because your ethics is your love and faith in God. That confused me a little bit, but I decided to just let that one go. But then I found that Abraham isn't the only person willing to murder his own child for God. In the Bible, they're actually all over the place. For example, in the book of Judges, this guy named Jephthah tells God that if he can win this battle, he will kill the first person who greets him when he comes home as a burnt offering. And who is the first person he sees? His only child, his beloved daughter, who runs to him playing with tambourines and singing, "Hi, Daddy." What? And does God say, no, don't kill your only child as a burnt offering to me? Or even, Jephthah, who did you expect to be the first person to greet you when you came home? No, it appears the most important point of this story is that Jephthah allows his beautiful daughter to go off into the woods for 2 months to mourn her virginity. I kept thinking, run, before she comes back, and he kills her by lighting her on fire. Even if you leave aside the creepy sacrifice your own offspring stories, the laws of the Old Testament were really hard to take. Leviticus and Deuteronomy are filled with archaic, just hard to imagine laws. Like if a man has sex with an animal, both the man and the animal should be killed, which I could almost understand for the man. But the animal, because the animal was a willing participant, because now the animals have the taste of human sex and won't be satisfied. Even things that I thought were set in stone, like literally set in stone, like the 10 Commandments, weren't. The 10 Commandments that we are almost familiar with are these rules that God simply told Moses on Mount Sinai without referring to them as commandments, without even setting them in stone. It's only later in Exodus, when Moses goes back up to Mount Sinai, that God gives him a set of 2 tablets of stone with these rules chiseled on them. When Moses gets back down off the mountain, he sees the people worshiping a golden calf, and he has a tantrum, and he smashes the stones before he reads them. So then Moses goes back up to Mount Sinai, and God gives him another set of stone tablets. And this is the first time at this point that they are referred to as the commandments, and they're chiseled into stone. So you'd sort of think that God's got to be pretty firm on the subject of commandments by now. But the rules are significantly different than those other rules. Like how all male children have to appear before God 3 times a year, however that's supposed to be accomplished, and how you shouldn't cook a baby goat in its mother's milk, and how every domestic animal's firstborn male should be sacrificed. But then the commandment goes on to say that if you don't want to sacrifice your donkey's firstborn male, you could go ahead and substitute a lamb's if you really needed to. Some people think that without the 10 Commandments, morality in society would be relative and wishy-washy, but in the Bible, morality is relative and wishy-washy. In fact, it sure seems like our modern morality is much more loving and humane than the Bible's morality. Well, Father Tom saw me outside of church after Mass one Sunday, and he said, "Julia, you know, you always look so very sad in Bible study class." And I said, "I'm sorry, Father, it's just that God is so offensive in the Bible. Really, it's like he's bipolar." He said, "Well, you know, the Old Testament. Just remember that the people who wrote it were an ancient Bronze Age civilization. I mean, the stories are legends. They're tales of trickery and deception that were told around the campfire by sheiks who made God impressive by their very ancient standards." I said, "Oh, wow. Looking at the Old Testament that way, it actually makes a lot of sense now, Father. Looking at the Old Testament that way, it's quite interesting." But Homer was also an ancient Bronze Age writer writing about gods. I mean, how much are we supposed to believe is actually true? And he said, "Well, There's no evidence that Abraham is anything other than legend, or Isaac, or Moses, or even the whole Exodus story. I said the Exodus story is a myth, and he said, well, myth-ish. And I said, how could something be myth-ish? And he said, well, the Exodus story is a myth in the sense that it never actually happened. But it's not a myth in the fact that the people believe the story was true and shape their identity as a culture based on thinking that. But Julia, you can't read the Bible with modern historical eyes. You've got to read it with the eyes of faith, because this is the story that God wants us to know. I left the church thinking, okay, calm down. This is the Old Testament. Old. Old is right in the title. A newer testament is coming up. And that's why God must have sent his son Jesus, because we clearly hadn't gotten the message right? Right? Jesus was all about tearing down those old, archaic ways of worship and reminding people that what mattered most was what we were like on the inside. I could hardly wait to meet Jesus again, as if it were the first time. But oh dear. Well, first of all, Jesus was much angrier than I expected him to be. I mean, I knew he got angry with all those money changers in the temple and everything, but I just had no idea that he was so angry so much of the time. And very impatient. Jesus says that he speaks in parables because the people, they just don't understand anything else. But the parables are often foggy and meaningless, and Jesus is snippy when even the disciples don't get them. He says to them, if you don't understand this parable, then how can you understand any parable? And are you incapable of understanding? I kept thinking, don't teach in parables then. It's not working. Even your staff doesn't understand them. Why don't you just say what you mean? Okay, so Jesus isn't so patient, and I think he picked a very ineffective lesson-giving technique, and he's angry most of the time, but that doesn't make him bad. It's just, wow, I really expected someone else. Some of the parables are not just foggy. To me, they're sort of offensive. Like in Luke, Jesus helps us understand God's relationship with humans by telling us a story about how God treats people the way people treat their slaves. They beat some more than they beat others. Okay, I know this was a different time and everything, and I really tried to keep that in mind as the Bible refers to slavery all over the place. And not only does it not say it's wrong, I mean, the Bible gives you advice about how you're supposed to keep your slaves and how slaves should behave obediently at all times to their masters. But I don't know, I guess I sort of thought the Son of God would say slavery was wrong. But no, Jesus does not say that. In fact, he uses slavery as an example of how God treats people. It was really hard to stay on Jesus' side when he started saying really aggressive, just hateful things. Like in Luke chapter 21, Jesus says that he is like a king who says, anyone who does not recognize me, bring them here and slaughter them before me. Or in John chapter 15, Jesus says, anyone who does not believe in me is like a withered branch that will be cast into the fire and burned. In Matthew, he says, I come not to bring peace, but a sword. And in Luke, he says, and if you don't have a sword, sell your clothes and buy one. Then Jesus just starts acting downright crazy. Like in Matthew chapter 21, when this fig tree doesn't have a fig for Jesus to eat, he condemns the fig tree to death. That's right, Jesus condemns a fig tree to death. Not a parable, by the way, just Jesus pissed off that the fig tree didn't have a fig for him to eat when he wanted one. Not exactly the Prince of Peace who taught us to turn the other cheek. And then there's family. I have to say that for me, the most deeply upsetting thing about Jesus is his family values, which is amazing when you think how there's so many groups out there who say they base their family values on the Bible. I mean, he seems to have no real close ties to his parents. He puts his mother off cruelly over and over again. At the wedding feast, he says to her, woman, what have I to do with you? And once, while he was speaking to a crowd, Mary waited patiently off to the side to talk to him, and Jesus said to the disciples, send her away, because you are my family now. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all tell this exact same story, but Mark actually tells us why Mary was there to see Jesus. He says Mary came to see Jesus to restrain him, because the people were saying he's gone out of his mind. I kept thinking, yes, let's go get Jesus and get him some help. Anyway, Jesus discourages any contact his converts have with their own families. He himself does not marry or have children, and he explicitly tells his followers not to have families as well, and if they do, they should just abandon them. Now, mostly Jesus says this because he believed the end of all time was imminent. Jesus said over and over again that the people who were alive when he was alive would not die naturally, but see the end times. He tells us this in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So, okay, Jesus tells us not to have families because he mistakenly believed that the end of all time was imminent, but then he tells us not to take care of the families that we do have already. Like in Luke chapter 14, Jesus says, anyone who comes to me and does not hate father and mother, brothers and sisters, wife and children, cannot be my disciple. I mean, isn't that what cults do? Get you to reject your family in order to inculcate you? So that's the New Testament family values for you, the supposed big improvement over the Old Testament family values, which seem to me to be mostly about incest and mass slaughter and protecting your own specific genetic line at all costs. After the Gospels, there's a bunch of letters written by the early Christians, the most important of which are written by St. Paul. Now, the Bible's view of women is dreadful in general. And, I know this was a different time and everything, but St. Paul, man, he really just gets right to the point. St. Paul writes, man is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or have any authority over a man. She must be silent. If there is anything a woman desires to know, let her ask her husband at home. For Adam was formed first, and then Eve. And it was not the man who was deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became the sinner. The Bible, the good book, the good news. I was so disillusioned with the Bible, by the time I finished the epistles, I just didn't think it could get any worse. But it did. We were just about to read the last and most oddball book of the Bible, Revelation. Now, apparently Revelation was written by St. John, the same person who wrote a gospel and some of the epistles. The biblical historian Ken Smith says that if his epistles can be seen as John on pot, well, Revelation is John on acid. It describes the end of days with a little too much gruesome enthusiasm. Revelation tells us that in heaven there is a throne, and the one who sat there had the appearance of a jasper. Around the throne are 4 living creatures, and they're covered with eyes, front and back. Day and night, they never stop saying, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. In heaven, Jesus resembles a dead lamb with 7 horns and 7 eyes. And when the gates of hell are open, locusts pour out with human faces wearing tiny crowns, and they sting people with their tails. Revelation tells us that only 144,000 people will be saved and even get into heaven, and that none of them will have, quote, defiled themselves with women. Which I guess excludes most heterosexual men from heaven. And depending on how you interpret that word defiled, I don't know, I would say it excludes all women too. After we finished Revelation, the entire Bible study group sat there, dumbfounded, our Bibles on our laps. Father Tom said, Revelation's a poem about the end of the world? I said, Father Tom, I am having a really hard time with this book. And he told me to pray for faith. I left the church thinking, is this one big practical joke? Where is my God, the Jesus I know, the one that I love and the one who loves me? I was driving home and I was stopped at a red light on Crenshaw and Wilshire, and it was a Sunday, and all these people were walking to church holding their Bibles, and I wanted to roll down the window and say, have you read that book? I mean, really? I thought, why would a God create people so imperfect, then blame them for their own imperfections? Aha, then send his son to be tortured and then murdered by those imperfect people to make up for how imperfect people were and how imperfect they inevitably were going to be. I mean, what a crazy idea. I looked at the crucifix And for the first time, instead of seeing a symbol of transcendence and compassion, I saw a horrible execution device. What kind of God sends his son to be tortured and killed like that? Oh, I guess it is the God of the Old Testament. That's exactly who would do something like that. But then, when I looked at Jesus as just a guy, just a human, just an impassioned young idealist who, sure, lost his temper a lot, but who could also go on teary-eyed about loving your neighbor and helping the poor. And because his ideas were so outspoken, it threatened those in power who ordered him to be tortured and then killed. And then reading how Jesus died, astonished and heartbroken that his own God abandoned him. His story became so tragic. And I thought, okay, I'll just not believe in God for 1 hour a day and see how things go. So the next day I tried it again. And I thought, wait a minute. What about all those people who are like unjustifiably jailed somewhere horrible and they're like in solitary confinement and all they do is pray? This means that I think those people are praying to nobody? Is that possible? And then I thought, we better get those people out of jail because no one's looking out for them but us. There is no God hearing their pleas. And I guess that goes for really poor people too, and really oppressed people who I had this vague idea that they had a God to comfort them, and then an even vaguer idea that God had orchestrated their lot for some unknowable grand design. I walked around thinking, oh, no one is minding the store. And I wondered how traffic worked, how we all just run in chaos all the time. And slowly, I began to see the world completely differently. It's like I had to rethink what I thought about everything. It's like I had to go change the wallpaper of my mind. Eventually, I was able to say goodbye to God, and I imagined this old guy, this old man, more like a broken down version of the God on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. But if you look closely, you could even see the Jesus from the poster in my high school bedroom. But older, much older, with long gray and white hair and lots of lines on his face. An old hippie who still smoked. And at one time, he seemed so all-powerful and all-knowing and all-protective. And now, he just seemed a little stinky. And I could just see him sitting on his suitcases near the front door of my house. And I went to him and said, I'm sorry, God. It's not you. It's me. It's just, I don't think you exist. I mean, God, look at it this way. It's really because I take you so seriously that I can't bring myself to believe in you. If it's any consolation, it's sort of a sign of respect. So sit here for a while if you want to. Stay a little bit if you need to. There's no big hurry. And slowly, over the course of several weeks, he just disappeared. Looking back on it, I think I just walked around in a daze for a few months. My mind became such a private place. I realized that I had shared my mind with a God my entire life, and I suddenly realized that my thoughts were completely my own. No one was monitoring them. No one was compassionately listening to them. My thoughts were my own private affair and something no one but me knew about. And I had so much thinking to do. One day, I was walking along Larchmont Boulevard, this busy shopping area near my house, and I was lost in thought thinking, so then I guess I don't think anything happens to us after we die. Consciousness fades and stops like every other organ, so people just die. And then I thought, wait a minute. So Hitler just died? Nobody sat him down and said, you screwed up, buddy, and now you're going to spend an eternity in a fiery hell. So Hitler just died. We better make sure that never happens again. And my brother Mike, this means that he just died. I always had this idea that Mike's death, while premature, was his divine destiny somehow, and that his spirit didn't really die, but it lived on. Not just in the memory of those that knew him, but in a real tangible sense. And I realized that I now thought he died. He really died, and he was gone forever. And then I realized I had to go back and basically kill off everyone I ever met who died, who I guess I didn't think really died. And then I thought, oh, I get it. So I'm going to die. So I'm going to die. And I sat down on a bench and I watched people bustling by and I thought, wow, life is so cheap and so precious. So I'm just another animal on Earth, just a type of primate, the third chimpanzee, better at using tools and able to talk. And then I am going to die. And there will be eons of time when I will not exist, just like the eons of time before I did. I'm in my 40s, about halfway through my life, I hope. At this moment, the sun and the earth and I are all middle-aged, just an animal on a planet in a solar system, nothing special. But then I think about it this way. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and for the first billion years on Earth, there was no life at all, nothing. And for the next 3 billion years, there was just algae and archaeobacteria, dull green and brown primordial slime for 3 billion years. And then just 500 million years ago or so, boom, complex life came on the scene. Plants and animals, including us who've been around for what? 100,000 years to 1,000,000 years or so, depending on what you consider to be human. I mean, if Genesis is a metaphor for creation, that metaphor is way off. God would not be creating man on the 6th day, but like the 6,000th day. And all of humanity would have been here for less than a minute. Actually, less than a second. Adam and Eve are just blinking their eyes, barely awake. So if you think about it, even if simple life exists readily all over the universe, it could be that any type of complex life is fairly rare. And then when you think how eyes have evolved over and over again, or how flying has evolved over and over again, but a species with a brain like ours, able to use language and tools the way we do, well, that's happened only once in 4.5 billion years on Earth. I mean, it's not so improbable as to be impossible given all the time involved and all the different ways that species have come up with to try to adapt. But still, it's got to be pretty rare for animals like us to turn up. And in my DNA is a history of this life on Earth, not just back to the African Pliocene, but even farther back to when we crawled out of the pond. And then even farther back from that, when there were only single-celled organisms, all told in the cells of my own body. And to think that I get to live at a time when I can know and understand that, it makes me feel so lucky. Then I started thinking about all the little happenstances, all the random little moves which resulted in me being alive, me in particular at this very moment, not just of my parents' meeting, but even of the millions of sperm against the hundreds of possible eggs. I thought about this randomness multiplying, my parents, their parents, Tom meeting Marie in Yakima, or Henrietta meeting Will on that cruise to Cuba, and then their parents and their parents and their parents, and all the ways it could have gone one way, but it went the way it went, and all the possible people who could just as easily be here in my place. Richard Dawkins wrote, "Certainly those unborn ghosts include poets greater than Keats, scientists greater than Newton. But in the teeth of these stupefying odds, it is you and I, in our ordinariness, that are here." I suddenly felt very deeply that I was alive with my own particular thoughts and my own particular story in this itty-bitty splash of time. And in that splash of time, I get to think about things and do stuff and love people and walk along Larchmont Boulevard with my coffee if I want to, and then that's it. I walked to my car and I had a ticket My time had expired. And I got in the car and I turned on the radio and there was that old Peggy Lee song. It used to be my mom's favorite. And I suddenly had this memory of us in the kitchen and that song coming on the radio and my mother flipping hamburgers and dancing around the kitchen, taking care of all of her kids.
So there is, my friends, then let's keep dancing. Let's break out the booze and have a ball. If that's all.